Now, what remains to be answered here in terms of this unit is what are the effects of this new wave of colonization on the people whom are being colonized here? What does the European and American dominance of these non-industrialized colonies with the strong sentiment of nationalism and strong racial overtones of this colonization mean to the people within these colonies? So, first, economically, and this is one of the things that has become one of the more long lasting effects of imperialism in the 19th century, and it continues today in global markets, is even though Africa and Asia, especially Southeast Asia, become more intricately integrated into these global trade networks, it is almost strictly as suppliers of raw material to the industrialized world. They become essentially the new American colonies of the 16th century. They are the suppliers of raw materials. They become the markets for cheap manufactured goods from the West. And at the same time, what this also does is it firmly establishes the West, i.e., Western Europe and the United States, as the dominant manufacturing centers until probably the middle or the later half of the 20th century, right? Now, one region of the world that, is significantly hurt by this new wave of imperialism is actually Latin America. Um, After the Latin American revolutions in the 18th century, Latin America was still the primary supplier of raw materials and natural resources for industrialization in Western Europe and the United States. But through colonization, these Western countries are able to supply themselves with raw materials cheaper and more easily than purchasing them from Latin America, which creates a serious economic downturn in Central and South America and even in the Caribbean. Clearly, the benefactors of this are the states of Europe and the United States. The money that flows in from these colonial possessions is not entirely, but heavily reinvested in the military technology. The strong nationalism between and the strong nationalistic competition between these Western European states is going to bear itself out in a massive military arms race that we'll talk more about in the lead up to World War One. Naval power becomes the clearest sign of military dominance in the 19th and 20th century. And a lot of this is based on a very famous book by Alfred Mahan, where he talks about the influence of sea power on history and how Great Britain and the superiority of their navy in the 16th and 17th century is what made them a world power in the 18th and 19th century. Now, also economically, what you see in this time period is a massive investment in infrastructure and modernization in these colonies. Now, the majority of this is limited to things that will further colonial power and colonial control, as well as facilitate the movement of resources and raw materials out of the country. So we're talking things like railroads, ports, post offices, telegraphs, roads. These are all things that help the colonial power, the mother country, further establish their control over the land. There's also a strong investment in religious missions, churches, and schools, because again, this enables further cultural imperialism. This helps to assimilate the colonized people into this Western Judeo Christian enlightened culture and gives them more economic power over the population. Now, the environmental impacts of imperialism are felt, almost strictly by the colonies. The industrialization of Afro-Eurasia leaves, massive scars on the landscape. Railroad construction requires huge amounts of resources and labor, requires massive amounts of land to be cleared, bridges to be built, rivers to be dammed, et cetera, et cetera. So you see large scale deforestation, especially in the African landscape, not only for this, but also to facilitate plantation style economies. You see the redirection of major rivers, especially in Southeast Asia, for irrigation. Also, industrial machinery allows for very large scale building projects and environmental restructuring. Two of the greatest examples of this are the Suez Canal in Egypt, which connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, cutting down the time of transport between Europe and the Indian Ocean. You also see the Panama Canal, which connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, cutting down the time from traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast of the Americas, right? Now, the plantation crops themselves also lead to large scale soil degradation. Farming in many of these colonial areas takes a massive hit, meaning that food is short while cash crops are well maintained. You also see during this time period dozens of species of wildlife that are exterminated either by environmental destruction or by invasive species. In fact, if you look at the map of species elimination and extinction, more species go extinct during this period of imperialism than any other single century in human history. And a lot of that is because of the introduction of new other animals, new plants, new diseases into these environments where they had never really existed before. Some examples up in the top left here, you have what's known as the dodo bird. This was a kind of flightless cousin of the pigeon that existed very prominently in Madagascar and the surrounding islands. This was completely wiped out when French sailors landed there in the 1700s, partially by hunting, but also by the introduction of European rats, which would not only kill dodo chicks, but also eat dodo eggs. You also have the Tasmanian wolf, which is hunted to extinction during this time period because it would interfere with it would interfere with building projects as well as destroying livestock in Southeast Asia. You also have the orangutan, which is one of the great ape species, which is still around today but is highly endangered. Again, mainly because of environmental and habitat destruction.